All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys some more about what I have been reading from Josephus in his history on the Roman Jewish War. This is a fascinating read, and really anyone who is interested in church history, anyone who was interested in learning about what Israel was like in the time of Christ, in the time of the apostles, should be reading Josephus's history on the Roman Jewish War. They need to read this history. It consists of 7 volumes, and right now I just finished book 5, so I'm going to start reading book 6 later on today. So after book 6, then there's book 7, and then I'm done, and then I'll read something else after that. But this has been really a journey, and there's not really a lot of books that I have read in my life that I can say I just kept reading with enthusiasm and interest. This is one of the few books that has done that to me. And the reason why is because it just opens up your mind more on what Jesus noticed or what Jesus saw when he was living in Judea. It gives you an idea as to the environment, the atmosphere that Jesus was in. It was violent. It was ruthless. It was cruel. It was sadistic. It was brutal. It wasn't what a lot of people think. It wasn't those Bible cartoons that you watched as a kid. It was a vicious, ruthless place. It was more like, okay, this may offend some people, but Judea was more like the most dangerous neighborhoods of Johannesburg, South Africa, than it was those cartoons that you watched in Sunday school class. Okay, this was Johannesburg. This wasn't this nice little cartoon area. It was violent. It was horrific. And right now I'm reading, well, I had just got done reading on the famine that erupted in Judea in the midst of this war. So the Romans are fighting to take over Jerusalem. They have just taken out one of the walls of the city. They are slowly besieging the city, and they are getting very close to just taking it over. And the Jews, they are putting up a hell of a fight. They are firing arrows and stones at the Romans. But at the same time, the Jews are in a very, very horrific predicament, and that is they have almost no food. They have almost no food. I talked about this in one of my latest videos in which I got into the famine that erupted in the city and how people were selling everything they had just to get a loaf of bread. But it was worse than that. People were murdering each other for food. The rebel forces would go into people's homes and search your entire house, and they would murder you and take what you had. And these people were so cruel, if they saw people on the ground starving to death, they would kill them. If they met people who were on the floor starving to death and begging them to kill them, they wouldn't kill them. So this is how twisted these people were. If you wanted to live, but you were starving to death, I'll kill them out of cruelty. If you were so miserable that you wanted to die, then they wouldn't kill you because they wanted you to suffer, even though you were going to die anyway. Now, I have to say this as a pre-qualification because you have all sorts of people who misinterpret things. I'm not supporting euthanasia, okay? But what I'm saying is that in their sick, twisted, warped view, if somebody was going to die anyway and they wanted to die, they would, oh, I'm not going to kill them just because I'm this cruel sadist who wants to allow people to suffer. I want to prolong suffering. They would murder people who they suspected were about to go and flee the city to go to the Roman camps. Now, the Romans, they were trying to encourage people to leave the city, and so people would try to get to the Romans because the Romans had food, and the Romans made it clear that they had food because they wanted people to come to their side. But eventually, it came to the point where the Jewish defenders of the city were putting up such a vicious fight. They were so stubborn and they were so obstinate, and it was so obvious that they were not going to surrender, that the Romans came up with this strategy to pressure the Judeans into just absolutely having to surrender. So what the Romans did is they built walls around the city to block anyone from getting out. And so now the famine was even worse, because before you had Jews who would leave the city at night to go look for wild plants and herbs to eat. Now, people would go out, foraging for wild plants and herbs, but then when they would come back to the city, the rebels would steal whatever plants and herbs that they found and take it for themselves. So the starvation was still ongoing, but now people couldn't even go out to look for wild plants or herbs. And, you wonder what kind of plants and herbs they were looking for. Well, Josephus does not specify this, but if I had to guess, knowing the Middle East and having some knowledge on the types of plants that they foraged for, I would assume that they were looking for wild oregano and wild thyme, which grows throughout much of the Levant, especially if you go to Syria. In Israel, wild herbs do grow, and it's pretty much oregano. In fact, the Israeli medical establishment made sure that the government would instate laws preventing Palestinians from taking oregano to the West Bank, because they want to take those wild plants for their medical experiments, because oregano has tremendous amounts of medicinal qualities. And as far as wild plants goes, I would assume that they were taking dandelion greens and probably silic or wild Swiss chard, because these plants are still abundant in the Middle East today, especially when you go to the West Bank, or if you go to Syria and Lebanon. These plants are still there in abundance. And these types of traditions of foraging plants don't really go away. People in Lebanon still go out and look for wild plants. Syrians go out and look for wild plants. Turks go out and look for wild plants. It's all over the Near East. So the Jews, they were now cut off from foraging for these wild plants and herbs, because the Romans had walls that prevented them from going that far out of the city. So now they're really, really starving, and people are dying in huge numbers. There was a team of Judeans whose jobs it was to bury the dead. And there was a deserter who managed to get out of the city, and he went to Titus, who was leading the Romans. And his job was to pay the people to bury the dead. And he said that they are... If you read Josephus, it says that he had reported to Titus that there were over 100,000 dead bodies, I believe in the front part of the city. But then it was found out later on that there was around 600,000 people dead in the city. It was horrific. So people were dropping dead left, right, and center from starvation. It was that bad. It got so bad that women were literally putting their own babies in ovens, okay? Thieves were going around into people's homes, murdering people and taking their stuff, whatever stuff that they had. Now, Jews who would try to desert the city, they would take their own gold and swallow it. They would swallow it to hold the gold in their own bodies, because they knew that if they were caught with gold, that was the end of them. So they would swallow the gold, and then they would, and this is crazy, but this is what Josephus talks about, they would actually defecate the gold out of their bodies. So there was a garrison. I should say this. Let me rephrase it. There was a large body of Arab and Syrian soldiers in the camp of the Romans. So Josephus doesn't say this, but I'm going to assume that these Arabs and Syrians were auxiliary forces for the Roman military, and they were within the Roman camp, the military camp. And these Arabs and Syrians, they were very unruly, and they didn't like the Jews. They didn't. They didn't like them. And one day there was a Syrian deserter. There was a Syrian soldier for the Roman military who deserted, and he found some feces with gold in it. So he said, "Hey, these people are swallowing their gold and they're defecating it out. Let's go out and find a bunch of Jews, kill them, cut their bodies open, and take the gold." So these Arabs and Syrian soldiers, Arab and Syrian armed men who were within the Roman camp, they saw thousands of Jews who had managed to flee the city coming to them because the Jews said, "Okay, we're going to flee. We're going to go to the Roman camp." So these Jews, they fled. They got out of the city. They got out of there, and they went to the Roman camp where these Arabs and Syrians were. And the Arabs and the Syrians murdered these people by the thousands. Josephus tells us that I would say over 2,000 of these fleers, of these refugees, were murdered, seeking refuge in the Roman camp, and their bodies were cut open. And it was very rare to find gold in these people's bodies. Most of them didn't swallow their gold. But the fact that they had found some gold, it only stoked up their greed even more. Well, let's just kill some more people. So a lot of people died this way. The general Titus, who would later be, he would ultimately become the emperor of Rome. Titus hated this. He didn't like this sort of barbarism. He tried to put some law and order in the camp. It was difficult to do because there were so many of these Arab and Syrian fighters. But the famine was that bad, and the greed and the slaughter and the cruelty was that horrendous. Not just within the walls of Jerusalem, but outside of the walls of Jerusalem as well. There was a tremendous amount of ruthlessness. Josephus even talks about how after the Roman-Jewish War was over, the Syrians went out of their way to slaughter tens of thousands of Jewish civilians. So the ethnic tension was definitely there, which really brings to light, it sheds more light on the sort of tribal and ethnic tension that we see in the Middle East today. The tension between the Syrian and the Jew, or the tension between the Arab and the Jew, was there even before Islam. I think what Islam did was it exasperated those tensions even more. But it was there pre-Islam. Now, there is a very interesting point that Josephus makes at the end of Book 5, Volume 5 of his history on the Roman-Jewish conflict. He talks about how if the Romans did not destroy the city, what would have happened? And he affirms that if the Romans did not destroy Jerusalem, if the Romans did not sack Jerusalem, then God himself would have sent fire from heaven to destroy Jerusalem, just as he did to the city of Sodom. This is Josephus talking. This is not some Christian polemicist. This is not one of the church fathers talking. This is a Jewish priest writing. I mean, it really does. It goes to show you that what the Bible was talking about, what the New Testament was talking about, was true. When the New Testament talks about the temple being filled with exploiters, when Jesus is just raging against the Jewish religious establishment, all of these things, all of these grievances were real. They were there. The corruption was there. The evil was there. The murderousness was there. The sadism was there. The cruelty, the ruthlessness, all of these things that the New Testament describes, as far as Judea goes, was there. It's all real. And here is Josephus, not a Christian, not a church father, not a saint, not a monk, not a whatever, not a Christian. He's saying these things. This is why I'm telling you, if you're interested in church history, if you are interested in the New Testament, if you are interested in understanding the political environment, the ideological atmosphere, the cultural atmosphere that Jesus was in, you need to read this book. You just gotta. And when I say read this book, I ain't talking like a professor in a university who tells you, oh yeah, just read book number 3, section 8. No, you gotta read it from beginning to end. I started from the intro, And I'm continuing on. I'm in book number 6 now. I started reading this book, I want to say in like late 2019. But then I stopped because it was, I thought this book is too long. It's 7 volumes. It's going to take too long. I want to read a smaller book. So I read some other books. But man, my mind, it kept telling me, Ted, you got to read this book. You got to read this book. I kept getting this thought in my mind. You got to read this book. You have to. Because once you read this book, then you can understand the New Testament more. You can understand what the church was in. And Eusebius, he references Josephus extensively in his church history. And Eusebius talks about how when the Jewish war was erupting, a lot of the Christians had left Judea. The disciples, the apostles, they had left. Why? Because they knew that the you-know-what was about to hit the fan, and it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth staying in this place. But the fact that Josephus says that if the Romans did not sack the city, that God himself would have sent fire from heaven just as he did Sodom. Now look at what he said. The fact that he says this tells me how evil it was in Judea in the time of Christ. This is not an anti-Semitic statement. This is not singling out the Jews. This is merely making an observation based upon the New Testament. And in the New Testament, it talks about a Jewish rabbi, a Semite named Jesus, who had his followers, Semites, the disciples, who lived in Judea and were persecuted by other Jews. This is not anti-Semitic. This is merely a phenomena that partially took place within Judean history. I am not limiting church history to Judea, obviously. The church history is universal. Church history entails all of the world, as far as Japan, as south as the depths of Africa, Australia, Fiji, Papua New Guinea. But when you begin with church history, you begin in Judea. And so understanding that part of church history, it's very, very helpful to read Josephus. Now, I want to read to you guys what Josephus wrote here. He says, "Here I cannot but speak my mind, and what the concern I am under dictates to me, and it is this. I suppose that had the Romans made any longer delay in coming against these villains, meaning the rebels, the city would either have been swallowed up by the ground opening upon them, or been overflowed by water, or else been destroyed by such thunder as the country of Sodom perished by. For it had..." Now this is where it gets very interesting here. "For it had brought forth a generation of men much more atheistical than were those that suffered under such punishments." So, when he talks about the city being swallowed by the ground, he's talking about the people who rebelled against Moses, who were swallowed by the earth. He talks about a flood. He's referencing the flood that destroyed the earth. But then he talks about the fire from heaven that destroyed Sodom. So he's saying that Jerusalem was more evil than Sodom. Jerusalem was more evil than the people who got swallowed up by the flood, Noah's flood. He's saying that Jerusalem was more evil than the people who rebelled against Moses. This is not an anti-Semitic statement. This is simply taking an observation made by a Jewish priest. Just as I would take an observation from the prophet Ezekiel or Zechariah or Jeremiah, all of whom criticized the ancient Israelites. And he is saying here that this generation that was defeated by the Romans was more evil, more atheistical. He doesn't say evil, atheistical, meaning they denied God, than those prior generations. Well, this opens up a whole new awareness, a whole new dimension of understanding when it comes to reading about this topic. There's a verse in the Old Testament, I'm pretty sure it's in the book of Proverbs, and it says, "The man who says there is no God is evil in all of his ways. The fool says in his heart there is no God." And this was written by Solomon. Now, what would make Solomon write this? I think that there was a seed of atheism that had been germinating for a long time in ancient Israel. And you see it in one of its more advanced stages in the Roman-Jewish conflict. You see it in that generation that came after Christ. You see it there. Now, you could see some of it in its inchoate stage in the time of Christ. For example, when Jesus is talking and he's confronting the Sadducees. The New Testament talks about the Sadducees. Sadducees were a very powerful religious faction in Judea. They were almost nothing like the Pharisees. Now, Josephus, he talks about the different sects that lived in Judea. He talks about the Sadducees, he talks about the Pharisees, but he also talks about the Essenes. So he talks about these three different factions. The Pharisees were the established order. They were the establishment. They were like the mainstream media of religion in Judea. Most of the people followed the Pharisaical establishment. But then you had the Sadducees. The Sadducees were borderline atheists. They believed that there was a God, but that he didn't really care about us. There were no angels, and there was no afterlife. So there is a God, but when we die, there's nothing. That's as close to atheism as you're going to get in ancient Israel. That's as close to atheism as you're going to get. So that's just one step behind saying there is no God. I mean, once you say there's no angels and there's no afterlife, that's just one step behind saying there is no God. One step before emphatic atheism. So atheism had been germinating in ancient Israel, albeit it was in an inchoate stage, but nonetheless it was there and it was growing. And you really see it in its full manifestation with Karl Marx in the 1800s. You see it with Vladimir Lenin. You see it with these types of historical figures. These people were of the Hebrew line, although they didn't believe in the Bible, they hated the Bible. But nonetheless, they were the full manifestation of atheism. And atheism had been germinating in ancient Israel. So it makes sense, and it's not really that surprising, that so many people of the line of Eber would later on just go out into full atheism. And the fact that Josephus here would say that Judea was worse than Sodom, well, that's the same thing that Christ said. Christ said that if Sodom saw me, they would believe in me. But you guys see me, but you don't believe in me. And Jesus himself said that if you go into a town and they reject you, just kick the dust off your feet and walk away, because those people are worse than Sodom. So what Jesus, and people could read the New Testament, oh, it's anti-Semitic. But Josephus is saying the same thing. So Josephus, I don't want to say confirms what Christ says, because Christ doesn't need confirmation. But what I would say is that it corroborates what Jesus says in the New Testament. It corresponds to what Jesus says in the New Testament. It matches what Jesus said in the New Testament. It's right there. It just gives you a better understanding, and it fortifies your knowledge that you would obtain from the New Testament. Super fascinating stuff. I encourage all of you guys to read Josephus. One thing that you will learn is that Judea, Israel, in the time of Christ and in the time of the apostles, was not what you see in the cartoons that you saw in Sunday school class. It's not Veggie Tales. It was brutal, vicious, and ruthless. It was closer to the south side of Chicago in the 70s, or when it was under the mob, than it was to those movies that you watched in the 90s in Sunday school. I remember years ago, I there was this commercial that would pop up in the radio a lot, and it was a commercial advertising Calvary Chapel. Now, for those of you who don't know, Calvary Chapel is probably the biggest, if not one of the biggest, evangelical, non-denominational church franchises out there. They are hundreds and hundreds of Calvary Chapels all over America. All over America. You go to Hawaii, California, Missouri, whatever, there's a bunch of Calvary Chapels. So this commercial was advertising for Calvary Chapel, and the narrator of the commercial said something like, "Come to Calvary Chapel and experience the very same spirituality that was in Israel when Christ was on the earth. Something like that. And I'm thinking, what the hell are you talking about? I'm reading Josephus. And I'm not getting Calvary Chapel. I'm not getting Starbucks. I'm getting the most dangerous neighborhoods in South Africa. I'm getting late 18th century revolutionary France. I'm getting Mexican drug cartels. I ain't getting Calvary Chapel here. You ain't getting Starbucks. You're getting absolutely murderous people. It's pretty horrific. But anyway, those are my thoughts. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.